honor to have the opportunity to present here, and especially as I missed out the conference. But I will also address the topic of language, attitudes, and ideologies. And there's also been a presentation at the conference focusing on Upper Sorbian, so I hope maybe I will bring something new to it. And those who have been to the presentation of my supervisor, Nicole Dowoborybinska and Kodula Ratajczakova, they will see that similar language ideologies and attitudes were observed in both studies, and their influence on processes of language shift is obvious. And slow language shift, unfortunately, also occurs in the communities in which Sorbian is continuously transmitted to the next generations, despite the desire to language maintenance. And if we have a closer analysis of the language practices and the language beliefs, they point to the processual nature, not only of language shift, but also maintenance. And I will point towards how this can be observed in subtle or also sometimes more explicit negotiations in the family context. As I've already hinted to, the presentation is based on research that I conducted for my dissertation. And yeah, everything has already been mentioned, so I can skip this. And yeah, it was during the time in the Upper Sorbian, or not Upper Sorbian, it's actually a whole Sorbian cultural magazine, that the topic of informal, non-institutional language maintenance became important to me, and I chose the family as my research focus. I will start with a few remarks on the material. That's the basis for both my dissertation and my presentation, and with a localization of my fieldwork in Lusatia in Germany, and a few words on my approach. So at the center of my dissertation are 6 interlingual couples and their families in Sorbian Catholic Upper Lusatia. Their aim is to pass on the minority language Sorbian and the majority language German to their children. And my interest was in their strategies of Sorbian language maintenance in the family, in the context of the desired maintenance of Sorbian in the community. And what also turned to be important is the negotiation of family language practices. In Lusatia, we have 2 Western Slavic languages. I tried to highlight the region here, or it's actually already on the map. German is the dominant societal language. It may not numerically be dominant in every village, but it has the character of the socially dominant language with a higher instrumental value, etc. The Sorbs are recognized as an official minority. They receive state funding. They also have an institutional network in support of Sorbian language maintenance. And Sorbian is present in school and in preschool education. So I think the external conditions are quite favorable, but we still have a highly varying ethno-linguistic vitality in different regions of Lusatia. And in the last century, we had a wide-ranging language shift. And so in most parts of Lusatia, Sorbian is not transmitted anymore in the families. And I decided to limit my fieldwork to the specific context of Catholic Upper Lusatia, which is the place where intergenerational language transmission continues. It has the highest proportion of speakers of Sorbian throughout Lusatia. So we have villages with over 50 to over 80% of speakers of Sorbian, but I refer to outdated estimates, so who knows. And also in this region, we deal with a very pronounced asymmetrical Sorbian-German bilingualism. So German monolingualism rarely develops into German monolingualism rarely develops into a German-Sorbian bilingualism. And we have a very widespread habit of accommodative convergence to German, and which is also discussed under the term of linguistic subordination norm, or if we look at it in terms of how the speakers perceive it, the rule of politeness or courtesy. The Catholic aspect is important because it has historically contributed to the preservation of Sorbian as a colloquial language in this part of Upper Lusatia. In addition to the linguistic boundary between German and Sorbian, the denominational boundary between Catholics and Protestants was even more important. To put it simply, the Catholicism was predominant where all inhabitants spoke Sorbian, while Protestantism was to be found in all the rest of Lusatia in a much larger area with Sorbian-speaking inhabitants, but also in the neighboring places with German-speaking inhabitants. You remember the previous map, so the yellow part is really what remained Catholic. The religious domain is still very important for understanding Sorbian language use in Catholic Upper Lusatia, but my decision to limit my project to this region has to do with the fact that especially there the family is still seen as the most important place for language transmission and also as a kind of backbone for the maintenance of Upper Sorbian. But until recently, we did not really hear much about specific efforts of how to support families and neither about the strategies of how families try to ensure that their children speak Sorbian. And there seems to be an expectation that parents pass on the language, but a reluctance to interfere in private language choices. And precisely this context shows that Sorbian language maintenance cannot simply be taken as granted as a part of socialization, and that it's a complex process that's connected with all those conscious and unconscious language practices and negotiation processes. Yes, all the participating couples were interlingual or linguistically mixed in the sense that one parent mainly speaks Sorbian with the children and one parent speaks German with the children. And the linguistic background of the partners is either Sorbian versus German, or one of the two or both have a complex Sorbian-German linguistic background. These were all heteronormative nuclear families, which was not my deliberate choice, but I accepted it as a consequence of approaching of how I approached the participants. I went through a few contact people and snowballing, and I was looking for bilingual families. So this is what I arrived at. Well, and these intermarried families are at the center of all kinds of conflicting ideologies and attitudes towards multilingualism, in particular towards Sorbian and German. And their negotiations of language use point to the social embeddedness of language choice. And the same basically applies to how they position themselves in with regard to their identity, but this is a topic that I didn't explore in depth. I would say at the outset that the families I've worked with have quite bilingually oriented family language policy, or each their own family language policy. They are not decidedly pro-Sorbian in their endeavors, but they are neither indifferent or even dismissive to Sorbian. Yes, and it was during my literature reviews that I came across the research field of family language policy, which later guided my research. It draws on research from many disciplines, and I focus primarily on language policy and planning, as well as language attitudes and ideologies. And other angles from which to look at FLP are child language acquisition and language socialization. And the family as a domain, context, or space is ideal to analyze the various influences that affect a language use, because it's an interface between the public and the private, and shows the interplay between the macro and the micro levels, between the explicit and the implicit. And for working within an FLP framework, it is important to bear in mind some particularities that concern the context of communities like the Sorbian one, minoritized autochthonous regional languages. There are some differences to broadly understood migratory contexts or diasporic context, which are often in the focus of FLP research. And the most important is that processes of language shift are a present and also a historical experience. And language socialization, as a consequence, takes place in a context in which the mechanisms of broader language shift processes can spill over into the family domain and counteract efforts to maintain the minority language. And in addition, there are fewer language-related resources to draw from than for languages that function as a dominant language elsewhere. But on the other hand, communities such as the Sorbian one have potentially better access to a community of speakers and to institutional educational support. In terms of data collection, biographic methods were the most important. Firstly, narrative biographic interviews in order to capture changes in the processual nature of language practices, attitudes, and approaches to language use. And this despite my short-term fieldwork and data collection. And secondly, language portrays as a creative prompt to start thinking and talking about language use with the younger participants. In addition, I included ethnographic participant observations, but only in a complementary manner. The interviews really formed the basis. So the observations were, of course, also to capture linguistic behavior in the moment of interaction. In my analysis, I referred to Bernard Spolsky's tripartite model of language policy. I focused primarily on the domain of the family and the home, but because of the biographical approach, I also was able to look at other societal domains because the conversations naturally also touched on language use outside the home. And I focused more on the family domain when I analyzed language practices, but when it came to language beliefs, I looked much more at the meso level, because these more general language attitudes and ideologies turned out to be very important for the individual language choices and practices. And for the third component of Spolsky's model for language management, I also drew on language management theory as understood by Jiřina Ustupny and Björn Jarnov. LMT is process-oriented, and in this way it takes a step towards conversation analysis, but it can also be applied to narrative material. Okay, in the rest of the presentation, I will turn to the family language policies of the participating families by going through the Spolsky components one by one. This separation is simplified, of course, because the components are closely interwoven, but this allows me to organize the material and as I said, I took the liberty of looking into more than the family and home domain, and so I can have a broader look at the socialization context. So this is by now probably heard that very often in the last days. The language practices, or in other words, the habitual and commonly accepted language choices of the individual family members, they shape the general soundscape for the children. And this means how often and when the children hear Sorbian and German, they are also the accepted norms of language choice in a family. And although these language practices are largely determined by the parents, the children also shape language use and have important agency. We'll see this with the example of the Domsch family. Carola, the mother, usually only speaks Sorbian with her children when her husband is not present. She says, when my husband's here now and we are together, most of the time we speak German. But she also has children, of course, and her son Vincent, who usually speaks Sorbian with his mother and his younger brother, and German with his father and his older sister, said that he also speaks Sorbian with his mother in his father's presence. So he said, when we travel, I continue to speak German with my dad and Sorbian with my mom. I just can't suddenly switch to speak German with my mom for an hour or when other people are there. Dad sometimes says it would be better if you spoke German, but it's the way it is. With my mother and my brother, I stick to speaking Sorbian. So this means that also the parents established a norm that says that German is that says that German is spoken when the whole family is together or when there are visitors who do not understand or speak Sorbian. We can see that the children also influence the language choices, and their habit of speaking Sorbian with their Sorbian-speaking mother is so firm that Vincent also addresses her in Sorbian in such situations. That means when his father is there or others. So let's have a look at the general patterns of language choice in the families. It's usually one parent who speaks German and one parent who speaks Sorbian, and additionally also German with the children. All couples or spouses use German among themselves, and the children all acquired Sorbian. Most of them also speak Sorbian with the Sorbian-speaking parent, but many of the children prefer to use German with their peers. And when the whole family comes together, we can observe two patterns, either language separation and the accommodation of the German-speaking parent, so that Sorbian is only spoken in his or her absence, or multilingual practices and the use of both Sorbian and German, and then consequently the German-speaking parent makes use of his or her receptive Sorbian language competence. The popular opal pattern of one person, one language actually only applies to the German-speaking parent. These parents rarely use Sorbian actively. One of the 6 in my study has a very good receptive knowledge of Sorbian, but the rest understands Sorbian mainly in relation to child-related topics. Aniek de Hover conducted a quantitative survey in a diasporic context, and with this pattern, she found that only in 36% of the families, the children actively speak the societally non-dominant language. So this is not particularly promising. The Sorbian context with a community of speakers of Sorbian may be more conducive, but still it has its own challenges. And to put it simply, speaking the minority language requires multilingualism and the learning of German. And on the other hand, it's not necessarily expected that someone who grew up with German could actively learn Sorbian later in life. And if you take a closer look at the language ideologies and attitudes towards Sorbian and German, such language choice patterns and the asymmetric bilingualism are not very surprising. They help, so the ideologies and attitudes help to explain why both the German-speaking and also the bilingual Sorbian-speaking inhabitants of Lusatia accept the dominant position of German. So language beliefs are the second component of Spolsky's policy model. And if we distinguish between language ideologies and language attitudes, then ideologies are understood as ideas, feelings, or truth claims about given languages and their users, and about how languages are and should be used in society. And language attitudes are evaluative reactions toward different languages and their speakers. So positive or negative feelings, beliefs or behaviors, and also behavioral intentions in response or as a reaction to languages and their speakers. And particularly influential are monolingual language ideologies and the understanding that German monolingualism is the norm, or that Sorbian-German bilingualism means the separate use of Sorbian and German, and also that multilingualism is something good as long as the languages are kept apart. So in a sense, parallel monolingualisms. And this was easy to see in the previous example from the Domsch family. German is spoken naturally in linguistically mixed situations. It's the languages that most people speak. And it's simply polite to speak German in order to include everyone, even people who are maybe not directly involved in a conversation. And it was Judith Dreisig who expressed the idea about German being the legitimately or unavoidably dominant language in the most succinct and brief way. For her, it's clear when which language can be used. And she put it this way. We always knew that you would have to speak German with those people and that you could speak Sorbian with those people. Often Sorbian is linked or limited to familiar people and situations. It's a language that immediately says something about the speaker. It's clear where he comes from, as opposed to German as a potentially anonymous language. And Catherine Woolard has discussed this as ideologies of authenticity and anonymity. And again, it's Judith. She said, if someone doesn't speak Sorbian to me, they don't find out that I speak Sorbian. So she doesn't initiate any Sorbian conversations with unknown people. And then we have Frank Simang, who describes how sometimes he avoided to use Sorbian in certain context from the outset. He told me that when we were young people, we didn't dare to speak Sorbian outside the Sorbian villages. You never knew how the others would react to it. And upon my question whether he ever experienced any unpleasant reaction, he said, no, we didn't necessarily provoke this. So they didn't speak Sorbian. And then there's the aspect of the German speakers' limited confidence, necessity, or willingness to learn Sorbian later in life. And this are quotes from the German-speaking partners. Patrick Schurig says, if he wanted to learn Sorbian, he would only want to understand it, but not to speak it. And if he should speak, then just where he's sure that he's pronouncing it correctly. Christina Petaschowa said that she told me, I've indeed tried to speak Sorbian with my children, especially when they were small. But when it gets more complicated or when other children are around, then I don't want to. Actually, the children have already said, you can speak Sorbian, like you could speak Sorbian more often. But no, I just don't feel comfortable with it. So she is rather shy and cannot overcome this insecurity. And Jürgen Dreisig says, well, he could have learned along with the children, but his interest was lacking back then, and it worked like that without Sorbian. And he said that maybe his attitude was probably a bit different, and that that it worked without learning Sorbian. And Stefan Domsch, who's the only one who understands Sorbian very well, and in my opinion, he could speak Sorbian without problems if he took a little effort, said, no, you can talk to me in Sorbian all day long. You'll always or mostly get a German answer from me. And we actually, in our conversation, a part of our conversation was in a bilingual back and forward switching mode. Okay. So now over to language attitudes. And the following stand out in the interviews. It's, for one, the positive feelings about Sorbian, which are associated to Sorbian as a language of solidarity, as a language of home, community, and attachment. Daniel Peters, for example, decided as an adolescent or young adult to speak Sorbian. He told me that Sorbian is always important, because if you live in a Sorbian environment, you have to know Sorbian. To me, they always said, come on, Daniel, come to the middle and sing along with us and this and that. And I've always felt good in this circle. In his case, the wish to belong even closer to the local community was so strong that he began to use and practice Sorbian, which he had previously only used at school during Sorbian lessons and by overhearing others. When we turn to the positive feelings towards German, then they have an advantage over the positive feelings towards Sorbian, and that they usually relate to status questions. German is the language of professional advancement and has instrumental value. Jasmin Domschitz, for example, is glad that the science subjects at school are taught in German and not in Sorbian. And she said that since they are in normal secondary school, and afterwards, during vocational training, there is no Sorbian anymore, and you would be lost if you had everything in Sorbian and didn't know what it's called in German. And negative feelings towards Sorbian can easily be explained by the fact that not everyone is able to understand it, and Sorbian is therefore perceived as potentially excluding in the Sorbs as a closed group. Christina Petaschowa, for example, she understands some Sorbian but uses it only very rarely. She made this experience. She said, sometimes it happens that the Sorbs want to talk quickly for themselves, and you as a German think, have they just been gossiping? And she doesn't feel really involved, as she says here. Sometimes you notice at all those Sorbian events that Germans are not welcome. Well, it's not written down that way, is it? But when the whole invitation is in Sorbian. So we see that also in the context of families who want to transmit the language, those attitudes and ideologies that hinder more language use and the acquisition of Sorbian are very, very widespread too. Sometimes Sorbian is perceived as downright inferior, and this shines through when participants mention the danger of xenophobically motivated violence at Sorbian parties, and if they do, then they usually play it down. Okay, to summarize briefly on language attitudes, we've seen the positive attitudes towards Sorbian and German respectively, ones regarding solidarity, the language of home, community, and attachment, and on the other hand, regarding status and instrumental value, for example, the language of professional advancement. And the negative attitudes towards Sorbian as a language that is potentially excluding, and towards the Sorbs as a closed group. And over to language management, which comprises efforts to modify and influence the language practices and language beliefs. I will first say something about the more explicit efforts involving older children, and then try to go back to more implicit aspects which are again closely linked to the language practices and language attitudes. The spontaneous management strategy that stands out among the examples are repeated requests and admonitions to speak Sorbian. Parents and also other adults remind children to speak Sorbian to each other, ask the children's peers and their relatives to speak Sorbian with the children. Kata Shurigoa, for example, tries to encourage her children's friends to speak Sorbian with them, but this is without much success. Before that, she has demanded Sorbian answers from her children instead of German ones. But she's the only Sorbian-speaking mother who's said to have done so, but she gave up this demand when her children signaled not to talk to her anymore. Now she simply continues to speak Sorbian when the children speak German to her, and that's a strategy that most Sorbian-speaking parents use if their children speak German to them. And I'll get back to this in a moment. Alexandra Blume tries to involve her eldest son in her efforts to get the younger children to speak Sorbian, and I will quote her. She said, "What I do with Anton when he's with the little ones, I explain that to him. I say, Anton, I would like Emilia and Jonas to learn Sorbian properly too, and I would like them to speak Sorbian. That's why I would be happy if you would also speak Sorbian with them. And then sometimes I just call out Anton Sorbian, or when I hear him speaking German and I just call out Anton, and then already comes, yes, Mama, Sorbian. But he knows why. So we talk about why I want that, and Anton, understands what I want, and therefore it's enough when I call out sometimes Anton, and then he says, yes, Mom, Sorbian. And examples like Alexandra's report can be more closely looked at with the help of language management theory, LMT. This highlights this constant negotiation in this trivial everyday language choices. LMT has its origins in the 1970s and 80s when the original approach of language policy research was already being criticized. LMT continues to take the concept of a language problem as a starting point for language management, but the focus is already on actual interaction and not on state language policy. So language management is conceptualized as a metalinguistic activity. The main distinction within LMT, but with fluid boundaries, is between organized language management, for example, on the macro-social level, and simple discourse-based language management, for example, self-correction. And management is conceptualized as taking place in potentially 5 stages. I will name and explain them with the next slide by using Alexandra's example of the admonitions to her son, Anton. So firstly, Alexandra notes a deviation in discourse. She notes that Anton speaks German with his siblings and not Sorbian as she would like him to do. Secondly, she evaluates this deviation negatively because she would like Anton to use Sorbian instead. Thirdly, she thinks about how she could get Anton to speak Sorbian and decides that a short admonition should suffice. And this so-called adjustment design happens more or less automatically in her case. Fourthly, the implementation follows. She calls Anton by his name, and Anton indeed seems to understand it as a request to switch to Sorbian. And fifthly, while thinking through her admonitions, Alexandra seems to be satisfied with her strategy because she knows that Anton understands her requests. And so much for a brief introduction to the LMT process. For me, it's even more interesting to go through the simple management process in cases where the Sorbian-speaking parents continue to speak Sorbian when their children speak to them in German, because this helps to understand how, despite the effort this strategy can require, it does not necessarily lead to more active use of Sorbian. And again, a brief introduction first. Elisabeth Lanza conducted a detailed study of concrete parent-child interactions in two diasporic interlingual families in the late 1980s. The children were 2 to 3 years old, and both parents spoke Norwegian and English, but each tried to speak only one language with their child. And Lanza observed 5 discourse strategies in response to children's utterances in the other language than in the parents' preferred language, or in response to language mixing. And these discourse strategies have a decisive influence on the child's language socialization. With the first 2, the minimal grasp strategy, this is, for example, responding with an unspecific or excuse me, and with the expressed guess strategy, which is rephrasing the child's utterance as a yes-no question in the preferred language. With these 2, the adult requests a response from the child. So these strategies can create a monolingual context for the child, even within an actually multilingual environment, especially if the child understands them as a request to switch back to the same language that the adult is speaking. And in a way, by signaling non-understanding, the parents simulate monolingualism, and thus they create the need to speak a particular language. The third strategy is the simple repetition of the child's statement in the preferred language of the adult. The adult, by using this repetitions, appears clearly multilingual, and the strategy is neutral or ambiguous as to which language the child should use. The child can understand it as a reaction to their choice of language and respond by switching to the other language, but the child can also understand it as a confirmation that they have been understood content-wise. And then the last 2 strategies create a decidedly bilingual context. The move-on strategy is what I mentioned Kata and Alexandra doing. It's when the adult continues in their own language. By language switching, the adult switches to the language used by the child. The parents' endeavor to continue speaking Sorbian when their children speak German with them is necessary for the children to acquire at least a receptive knowledge of Sorbian. But as already mentioned, the move-on strategy is basically neutral as far as the need or the opportunity to speak Sorbian is concerned. I would like to go through this using the example of a report by André Blume and with the help of the LMT stages, but here the languages are the other way around. So André Blume speaks German with his son, who in the example speaks to him in Sorbian. André understands Sorbian to some extent, and he told me that all 3 children know with whom they should speak which language, German to him and Sorbian to his wife, Alexandra. Said with all 3 of them, it worked out relatively quickly that they could distinguish with whom to speak what. Sometimes, and this is the first stage in LMT, Jonas speaks Sorbian to André. Secondly, André does not see this as a problem, but rather neutrally. And consequently, we cannot observe the third stage because there is no correction and no adaptation. André understands Jonas and he sees no reason to interrupt the conversation, and he continues to speak German as usual. And André, by not demanding that his son should speak to him in German, he creates a possibility for the son to use both languages flexibly, and most importantly, he signals that Sorbian is a language that can be spoken and is welcome. And this means that I would evaluate the same strategy differently when applied to German or Sorbian, because the permanent use of the move on strategy in relation to Sorbian can lead to habitual bilingual conversations in which the child rarely speaks Sorbian. And we saw this with the children of the Schurig family. And yeah, because Sorbian is often an optional language in interpersonal communication, this can lead to the children speaking Sorbian less confidently. Yeah, so much for simple management, like Alexandra's admonitions, or sticking to one's language. Yeah. How about instances of organized management, or at least more organized management? That is management which does not only influence a certain interaction, but creates a certain frame or baseline, and management that is more likely to be discussed. And among such instances, there is clearly the decision to move to Sorbian-speaking Lusatia. So we have two families among those 6 who only later moved there. And this decision was influenced also by considerations of the linguistic environment, besides all the other reasons. So this is a clear example for this. But then the most explicitly discussed decision relates to the type of school the children will attend and the extent to which Sorbian should play a role in their school education, because this is a one-time decision. So parents, yeah, if they want or not, they discuss it among each other. And among the participating families, none opted either opted for or was able to realize a Sorbian-oriented or Sorbian-centered school education for their children. One family opted for Sorbian-focused primary school education and then for a German school from year 5 onwards. 2 families wanted Sorbian-focused education, but the children were placed in groups for pupils whose language skills were not sufficient for the highest or for the higher Sorbian level. And 3 families made a conscious decision in favor of either German medium schooling or schooling in the group with the lowest Sorbian level. And these decisions have a lot to do with the language ideologies and attitudes that I have already discussed. And they have an influence on language socialization because the groups, according to the level of Sorbian in school, differ in their peer communication, and not only in the intensity of Sorbian in schooling or used by the teachers. Yes, but not everything that's important for language socialization is discussed explicitly in the families. Much is implicit and occurs unconsciously. I looked at decisions that have an influence on the linguistic environment and the linguistic input that children receive. And one of the things which is more implicit is the negotiation of the language choice patterns in the family, which is usually not discussed between the parents. It's more based on the German-speaking parents' non-opposing attitude towards the Sorbian-speaking partners' wish to pass on Sorbian to the children. And then, besides this, it's also influenced by either positive or negative experiences by either monolingualism or bilingualism during the parents' own childhood. In the families where the use of Sorbian is limited to the absence of the German-speaking parent, the parents both grew up in a more or less monolingual context in the family, in their own family. So either Sorbian or German. And in all cases, both parents grew up in the Sorbian-speaking part of Lusatia or close to it, or they had family ties there. And then the parent who today speaks Sorbian sometimes had a bad experience with getting used to German after finishing school. And the parent who today speaks German these partners already experienced in their childhood that living without Sorbian in a Sorbian context is possible. So they heard and experienced Sorbian during family visits, or they had parents who spoke to them in German while they spoke Sorbian among each other. And with the other families who speak both German and Sorbian when everyone is together, we see that there are additional circumstances that make these basic language choices a bit more conscious. So in the case of the families who lived outside Lusatia for a certain time, it's the limited input of Sorbian, which is an obvious obstacle, and therefore Sorbian is spoken also in the presence of the partner. Then the German-speaking parents in some cases didn't experience previously how the Sorbian-German parallel worlds and all the accommodative practices function. So they were, in a sense, more open to let their partners speak Sorbian in their presence. And then very strong influence is also found in the dissatisfaction with the linguistic aspects of their own upbringing. So among the parents is a Sorbian-speaking parent who was spoken to in German by his own Sorbian-speaking parents. This was the one who decided later to actively start speaking Sorbian. And it was his decision. So the brother already decided, didn't make this step towards speaking Sorbian. And another example is a German-speaking parent who experienced language-related conflicts between their own parents, who were also Sorbian and German, respectively. And then there are a few factors that emerge from the interviews that are relevant to the children's language socialization, but which the participants did not consider when thinking about language use in the family, or which they did not address in our conversations. These are the personality of the parents, the division of parenting and paid work, and the use or non-use of media in different languages. So Sorbian literacy practices such as reading played a fairly marginal role in the reflections on language use. If we look at the hopes for socialization into speaking Sorbian in the wider society or by peers, which some parents had because they realized that they cannot provide everything at home, these hopes are not always realized. Most children are ready to use Sorbian if their interlocutor prefers Sorbian, at least if it's not a familiar person. With me, they all spoke Sorbian. And most children are also very attached to the Sorbian, or rather to the local community. So they don't have any, well, mostly not negative experiences with growing up with in this multilingual context. And we have to bear in mind, of course, that a person's language repertoire is constantly changing, and some of the children I've spoken to, some of whom are already adults, they will have to make a conscious decision to speak Sorbian in the future, if it's important to them, simply because it's their weaker language in many domains. But this can certainly happen, and it will be influenced by an environment that is conducive to this. And I'll share a few experiences that the participating children have made. Judith Dreisig is, she may represent a person that I just described now. She generally favored German up to now, and her bilingual friends only speak German with her. But she definitely wants her future children to experience Sorbian culture and also learn a little Sorbian. So regarding the first aspect, she said, many speak with me German since childhood. They speak Sorbian and they also know that I can actually speak it too, but as soon as they turn to me and ask me something, then it immediately continues in German. So I think since childhood, it's just become such a habit that I am like that. On the second aspect, I would also like my children to take this with them, and that they also learn this and find this love also for our traditions. That is something so beautiful. So that will be very important to me. If I ever have children, that it all goes like that, because everything is so normal with us that at least such a touch of Sorbian is in it. Karol Schurig is a bit more reserved in this respect, and his example shows that being multilingual can also include conflicts, because he said, I struggled a bit as to what is actually my mother tongue. I would say that I know German better. I can explain things better. I can think of the right words faster, not like in Sorbian. I sometimes use the wrong word or it doesn't come to me. And the example of Philipp Dreisig, on the other hand, shows that even though he rarely initiates Sorbian conversation himself and does not write in Sorbian, he willingly responds verbally in Sorbian, or he joins also a conversation in Sorbian. He refers to an example from his fire brigade. He says that there I also have two who only write to me in Sorbian because they know that I know Sorbian. And one of them always writes to me in Sorbian, and we also speak Sorbian, always. Vincent Domsch is a confident speaker of Sorbian, and although he mostly uses German with his peers, he's very proud that he grew up speaking two languages at the same time. And this pride in his simultaneous bilingual language acquisition is also part of the family narrative. He said that this is also what many find good, that I could grow up on two sides, that I spoke German with some people and Sorbian with others, and that's what many people said, including the teachers. That's actually the best thing you can get when you live here. And his sister Yasmin, who rebelled against Sorbian at the bilingual school, now misses speaking Sorbian in the new German-speaking school environment. She says, well, now I'm at a German school and I miss Sorbian a bit. At the school, there hardly anyone knows the Sorbian language. It's all in German. But I explain it a little bit to the friends who are interested, what it is, where I come from. I have left out one domain that is of relevance to the families in the study, and this is the religious domain and the Catholic Church. And this is a context that can be significant for socialization towards speaking Sorbian, depending on how frequently the family participates in parish life, or in how frequent churchgoers they are, because it is the most obvious context for the use of Sorbian. It is the only domain where Sorbian is dominant and where this dominance is partly also defended, but neither in this domain it's the case that language use is uncontested. So we find struggles there as well. But still, the association of church and Sorbian language is quite strong. And I think I still have a bit of time, so I'll give you a few examples from the children I talked to. For example, Dominik Simang, he speaks mostly German with his brother Florian. He said it always depends on the situation. Sometimes German and sometimes Sorbian, but German is sometimes easier. So, but if it's something Sorbian to talk about, also about mass or so, then we simply speak Sorbian. Then my brother continues if I start speaking Sorbian, and he continues in Sorbian, and I do the same the other way around. And Philipp Dreisig and his friends and relatives during Easter preparations do not accommodate for the only non-speaker is Sorbian as he does usually. He said, we have one with us who also only knows German, but he nonetheless sings along and participates in Sorbian. And if he's there, of course, always first in German. But it's a little different there, because if he comes and we sit there already and speak Sorbian, we continue to speak Sorbian. It's like, well, not arrogant, but he has to see what he understands or doesn't understand. Well, it's probably also always dependent on the person a bit, but yeah. So maybe the person is familiar enough to continue speaking Sorbian, but still this is a difference to what he does in other situations. Then it's he described it very poignantly for the firefighters, that when they after meetings continue in loose conversation, then those who speak Sorbian, they just leave the room and have a smoke outside, and then they speak Sorbian, but not if they are in the same room with of the meeting. And Judith Dreisig, again, she prefers to attend Sorbian Mass instead of German, although the family often went to German services. And she says about religious life that it was all Sorbian, everything Sorbian. And I also say that I prefer to go to the Sorbian Mass than to the German Mass, because the prayers and everything, we always learned all that in Sorbian. But then, yes, and she continues to repeat this several times. And she also likes to sing in church. She likes to sing along and read along from the hymn book. She says, this is also fine. That goes very smoothly for whatever reason. I don't know why you can suddenly read what's written there so quickly. I don't know, but it works. I also like to sing along at Mass. And for her, singing and reading along from the hymn book is basically the only literacy practice she engages in Sorbian. During school times, she had Sorbian as a foreign language at school, but otherwise she only used it orally. Okay. So I will try to summarize briefly and get beginning and end together. For the family language policies in my study, what characterizes them is their decidedly bilingual orientation, and they are neither decidedly pro-Sorbian nor indifferent or opposing towards Sorbian, and by this they shed light on the societal language socialization environment, not only on the individual family language policies. And yeah, and this is characteristic a bit for this autochthonous minoritist language situation, I would say. So in other words, these rather laissez-faire FLPs provide also food for thought for possible practical conclusions, not only for the families, but also for the societal level. Okay, what's noteworthy is that the parental language use patterns are often implicitly negotiated. And the most explicit decision is the choice of language for schooling. And the explicit strategies to motivate or increase the use of Sorbian tend to be directed at slightly older children who already have a preference mostly for German. So they include asking the children to speak Sorbian among themselves, or the children's relatives and peers to speak Sorbian to the children. Then, of course, the influence of language attitudes and ideologies in the broader community, with Sorbian being the language of solidarity, home, community, attachment, but on the other hand, potentially excluding language, the Sorbs as a closed group, and German as the language of professional advancement, status, a language with instrumental value. And consequently, we observe the frequent accommodation of speakers of German, and also the language separation. Asymmetric bilingualism is a real obstacle. So especially the feelings of exclusion or impoliteness, and the socialization into speaking Sorbian in the wider society or by peers is not automatically granted. And I've got the impression that children seem to have already to be confident speakers of Sorbian in order for other children to speak Sorbian to them. And as I said at the end, that the most obvious context for the use of Sorbian is the Catholic Church. Yes, and as a final remark, language choices are only one aspect of everyday family life and what makes shared we in the family. So there's much more to it, which was shown by the biographic interviews, but which I couldn't refer to here. And of course, language is not necessarily always the central challenge that the families have to overcome. And I'm very grateful that I found these families and that they took the time to share their experiences with me. And I thank you for your attention. And once again, thank you to Professor Maria del Mar van Rel for making this meeting possible. And ja, Butron de Jacques, herzlichen Dank, moltes gracias.